Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome back. As someone who has not been a long-standing part of this China-Africa Research Initiative, but has been a faculty colleague for many years, it's been a pleasure for me to participate in this program. My name is Brian Levy, and I'm the Professor of Practice of International Development at SAIS. What I thought was truly remarkable about yesterday was the way in which almost every presentation said, let's look behind these two words, China and Africa, and let's go inside the black box. And when we go inside the black box, what we always find, and we found I suspect every single presentation that was done yesterday, is we find complexity and we find multiplicity. We find a multiplicity of contexts, of country contexts, of sectoral contexts, of de facto and de jure rules of the game. And within each of these contexts, we find a multiplicity of actors, of Chinese actors, of African actors. And out of that complex set of interactions, we get a variety of different outcomes. And perhaps over time, we will begin to see the pattern behind the patterns. But what is terrific about today's panel is it offers us yet another set of data points on this complexity and of the agency behind this complexity. Formally, the panel is called African State Capacity, Bureaucracies, and Norm Diffusion. In practice, like all the panels, we have 4 terrific presentations, each of which wrestle with complexity and agency from a variety of different angles. We will hear first from Hezron Makundi, who is on the faculty at the University of Dar es Salaam and also finishing his PhD at Catholic University in Leuven. And he will speak about the complexity and agency in the context of bargaining over technological capabilities. Then our second presentation will be Tom de Bruyn, who is also on the, he's in the Flemish government and also is finalizing his PhD at the Catholic University of Leuven. And he will talk about complexity and agency in the context of capacity building initiatives. Then, as our third speaker this morning, we have Professor Lena Ben Abdallah, who is the Assistant Professor of Politics and International Relations at Wake Forest University, whose PhD in political science is from the University of Florida. And she will take another angle on agency and complexity by exploring the fascinating puzzle of the extent to which skills transfers initiatives are also accompanied by transfers of norms. And then finally, we have Professor Paul Kadetz, who is on the faculty at Drew University, an endowed chair of science and society, director of programs in medical humanities, and has a long-standing, eminent research track record in the area of the interaction between development and health. And he will speak about complexity and agency in the context of health diplomacy. So we have a feast, a continuation of our feast this morning. And let me begin with you, Hezron.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm very glad again to be here, and thanks to Professor Broughtingham and her team at CARI. So I'm going to present the article which I co-authored with my 2 senior colleagues at the University of Leuven. And the main purpose of this article is actually to challenge the narrative that African and particularly Tanzanian actors are weakly coordinated, they are passive when it comes to Chinese engagement. And the focus actually here is on issues related to the acquisition of technological capacity. I will begin with this quote, which was given out by Tanzanian President then Jakaya Kikwete in 2013 when President Xi Jinping visited Tanzania during that time. And he was actually responding to the questions of the journalists who were kind of challenging the engagement between Tanzania and China. And he said, if we have a China-Africa forum, we are looking for investments, technology, markets, and development assistance. This is all we are getting from China, and our relationship with China is all about that. So actually, the message which we get from this quote is that we actually have an African president who seems to be in control of things, of the relation. But again, another message is that technology is also an important part of the equations when it comes to the engagement between China and Africa, or African countries. Just in a summary, if you track back the relationship between China and Tanzania in relation to issues of technology, it is very important to look at the issues of history, and here you encounter the ideological alignment which were there between then the Prime Minister and the President of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, and Chairman Mao. And this was actually translated into the relationship between then the Communist Party of China, but also TANU, which then became CCM, which has been, and it's still the ruling party of Tanzania. And I would like to make a note that actually this political relation or engagement, because then Tanzania was in the forefront of the liberation struggle for Africa. Many African countries were trying to gain their independence from their European colonial masters, and Julius Nyerere was one of the leaders of this struggle. And of course, you know that Beijing was also trying to also assist this liberation process. So there was a lot of alignment and actually the coherence in terms of at least the ambitions in this particular line. But then this has also been translated into the engagement between China and Tanzania, even the contemporary relations. So many times you speak to the Tanzanian bureaucrats and civil servants, they will always quote this. They will say China and Tanzania have a very strong, long political history, and this should always be reflected in whatever that happens today in terms of the engagement between China and Tanzania. But one more interesting thing which will also reflect the urgency of the Tanzanian government and civil servant within the Tanzanian government bureaucracy system is that throughout this time, because Tanzania gained independence in 1961, and since then, there has been a tendency of Tanzania getting the aid, or at least acquiring the aid from both the North and the South partners. So throughout the time, there was a time when we had the Cold War, but still the Tanzanian government will still receive the aid, for example, from its colonial master, Britain, and at the same time, of course, receiving Chinese aid and sometimes Indian and Japanese, and from many, many different countries, which sometimes it could be very complex to understand that kind of a situation, like how would an African country manage to consolidate and acquire aid from all these countries? So this is something very interesting. Again, throughout the relationship with China, we have a lot of good examples. Many times people, when they speak about China, Africa, they call the Tanzania-Zambia Railway. I think it was an iconic kind of an infrastructural project which has ever been funded by the Chinese government, and many other called whole plants which were constructed by the Chinese government. And this reflects, of course, the roots of Chinese assistance to Tanzania in relation, of course, to industrial and technological capacity. But now things have changed. I think the market has taken over. So that kind of a state-driven model of development assistance, which has been in part of the China-Tanzania kind of a cooperation, has really shifted into a different model in which, of course, state-owned enterprise, private actors are playing a very important role. So with this kind of evolution, of course, new challenges are in place, but also, of course, opportunities. Because, for example, if you track history, and I think Professor Browtingham has written about this, like in terms of challenges which were faced by those state-driven projects, like plants which are constructed by the Chinese government, handed over to the Tanzanian government, and then things don't come out well. They are maybe overcapacity, they don't perform well, or they just get shut down like a few years after they are initiated. And because maybe of the state failure, and sometimes people would say weak skills transfer and things like that, then things didn't come well. But now then, when you have the profit-oriented actors, I think the consciousness of doing it in a more like business orientation becomes more interesting to understand compared to that kind of a state path. Just briefly to talk about the research, mainly the article is based on research which I did we did on civil servants, people working for the government, particularly the central government. We collected some information related to the top executive like presidents and ministers, but we really didn't interview them. It's only like some quotes, reports, and documents which were from them. But people who are working, like, for example, people at the Ministry of Finance dealing with external financing, we interviewed them, we talked to them. People who are running projects which are funded by China, for example, people at the Ministry of Education who are coordinating the Chinese scholarship program and the way they were kind of influencing, for example, the distribution of the scholarship positions in terms of like field of studies and things like that. So we talked to those kinds of people. And we also did like a workshop, but we also really work on the literature. And we use a conceptual framework developed by Lindsay Whitfield, which talks about development negotiations. And from this kind of a conceptual framework, the main argument is that the negotiation process in the development framework is based on a lot of things. It's not only just individuals who are just with individualistic kind of drive, but rather driven, of course, or influenced by a number of issues like the history around the institutional framework which surrounds them, their own perspectives and perceptions about the other side, and they use that to accumulate the negotiation capital and, of course, the power relation, and they use that, of course, to establish their own negotiation strategy, and that goes all the way to the process until the outcomes. So this is just a framework. I'm not going to talk in detail about it, but the main thing is that both the recipients and the donors, when it comes to the development negotiations, will always accumulate a certain capital which is derived from their own economic, political, and historical, and of course, institutional preconditions. So many factors which surround these actors are into play to define their own negotiation capital, and this is now being used to define their negotiation strategy. And again, it is going now to be multiplied into the process of signing agreement, the implementation of the project, and even the definition of the outcomes of this negotiation process. Now, to summarize now the actual negotiation process which took place in the course of bargaining for technological and partly industrial capacity under the Chinese engagement program. So we selected a number of programs in which we did the investigation. So one thing, there were many attempts which were made by the Tanzanian government civil servants to acquire or attract Chinese assistance, but also Chinese investment. So, for example, I gave the example of the Export Processing Zone Authority. So there was one time when during the FOCAC meeting, China pledged to build I don't remember the actual number, but at least a set of economic processing zone authorities, and I think there was literature about it, like some of them built in Ethiopia, Nigeria, and other African countries. And actually, Tanzania prepared and submitted a proposal to the Chinese government to have one of them, but yeah, it wasn't successful. So similarly for the Agricultural Technology Demonstration Center, Tanzania also submitted a proposal, and this one was successful. And of course, a number of other initiatives which are being pledged by the Chinese government under the framework of FOCAC. So these are being submitted to the government, but yeah, not all of them become successful, but it is to show that actually the government officials are aware. They are aware of what China has to offer to African countries, and they are always trying to make pledges or to make submissions to apply for them. Another important point is that actually the Tanzanian government developed a so-called a document which is 29 pages in 2016 called a strategic document on industrial cooperation between China and Tanzania. It is for the first time that the government of Tanzania built that kind of, or developed or created such a kind of a document in which it provides a framework of areas of cooperation in which Tanzania wishes to engage with China. And you would never have any sort of document of that type in relation to any other development partner for Tanzania. Throughout the research, we also found out that the Tanzanian government officials were engaged in many ways in negotiating the terms of different agreements with the Chinese government institutions. For example, the loan interest rates has been reduced. There was one case where it started at 4% and then it went all the way down to 1.5%. And they said there was a lot of intense discussions and negotiations, and it took some time to reach that point. And you would just imagine that at some point, of course, there's an announcement that there's a loan for a certain program, infrastructure program, and you think maybe it's just China coming and giving this money. But there is a lot of heavy work in the background which is taking place between bureaucrats and officials between the two governments to reach that particular stage. Interestingly, there has been a lot of critics to the Tanzanian government in relation to borrowing patterns in terms of taking a lot of loans from different external agencies, and particularly, of course, Chinese loans. And this has led into the government being conscious of not borrowing too much, not having these issues of debt and sustainability, but also dependency on China. And what they do, especially people at the Ministry of Finance, they actually regulate the borrowing patterns from China. For example, they delay projects. They actually disaggregate projects like into phases. They say, we have the national ICT broadband backbone infrastructure, which will be funded by China, but it's a very huge project, so we'll divide it into phase 1 up to phase 4. And doing that will make the project much longer, but also the financial amount of finance which is going to be involved in the project becomes much less in terms of being felt as a huge burden. So again, this is also interesting that actually at some point, of course, Tanzanian government officials also take the free ride to the non-interference policy of the Chinese government. So like there's a huge project, and then there are some commitments of the Tanzanian side to the project, but then the Tanzanian government officials would not implement their aspect or their component of that agreement, and they believe that they can get away with it. And this is not always the case when it comes to the Western donors, because it becomes tougher and tense when you deal with the Western donors in this kind of a situation. This is my last slide, and it points now to the new leadership of Tanzania. I don't like to talk so much about President Magufuli, but at least his anti-corruption measures has also been with disruptive kind of effect to the Chinese engagement. So there are cases of suspensions and delays of projects which were supposed to be funded by China. I think yesterday there was a discussion about the standard gauge railway, and now this project, which was supposed to be funded by 7.6 billion Chinese Exim Bank funding, has been given to actually a Turkish firm. And so it's no longer going to be done by Chinese, and some discussions or rumors tells that the new president felt like there was like inflation of the cost of the project, and he decided that he's not going with the Chinese option. So no Chinese loan and no Chinese construction company is going to be involved in this particular project. And even there was one incident where actually the former CEO of the Tanzanian Ports Authority has been jailed, I think, for 5 years or so, because he gave a contract to expand the port to a Chinese company because he hid some financing from Chinese government. So there are even investigations going on, and also a number of other effects which could be considered to be negative on China. But yeah, in other cases, actually, the anti-corruption measures of President Magufuli are turning out to be positive for China, because in some projects, which now the tendering becomes more competitive, actually the Chinese companies tend to win. And some of those projects are not even funded by the Chinese financial institutions. So some of it end up being positive on China. And I would also conclude by saying the effects of Magufuli are not exclusively to Chinese relations or Chinese enterprises. I think his presidents or his government has clashed with even the Canadian mining company Acacia and other foreign companies. So it's not just about China with Magufuli. But the idea of my presentation is just to give the issues of Tanzanian agency, but also the control of the government in relation to Chinese engagement. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hezron. Now let's turn to Tom De Bruyn for the second presentation on decision-making power and agency in Chinese, Brazilian, and Indian capacity building projects.
Hello everyone, good morning. First of all, I would like to thank you that I'm here, and also I'd like to thank you on behalf of our institution, because in the last 3 years or 3 conferences that have been held, 1 or 2 colleagues of my institution were able and were invited to come here, so we're very grateful for this. And the second thanks I would also like to go that I can be after Hezron, who has been a colleague of mine for the last 5 years at the institution in which I was working until last year. Now I'm working for the Flemish government, the government of Flanders. Now, I'm going to present something. I'm going to broaden a bit the discussion to go beyond China, but also to look at Brazil and India, the number of capacity building projects, and to look at the agency in the implementation of these projects. Now, to give you a little background of this project, our institution is mainly involved in consultancy work. So we evaluate projects and programs of development donors, traditional donors mainly. And at a certain moment in 2010, the Belgian government and also the Flemish government, which is part of Belgium but has its own aid agency, they asked us to look at and to map out the activities of some of, at that moment, the emerging powers in African countries, and especially in countries in which in which Belgium and Flanders were active, to see whether they could explore trilateral cooperation with one or more of these donors, partner countries. In the end, Belgium as well as Flanders decided against it, but it enabled us to do some research. And the first thing that we had to look at, we had to look at the DRC, so Congo, the Democratic Republic in Congo, and then also Mozambique and Malawi, because that were the partner countries of Belgium on the one hand and Flanders on the other hand. And indeed, what had happened in the 2009, 2010s was that these countries had forged more alliances in relations with a number of South cooperation development providers, or emerging countries as they are called in other literature. And these are pictures of President Gebuza of Mozambique, who's meeting like the heads of state of India, Brazil, and China. Now, when we were doing our research, we were talking to representatives of China, India, and Brazil, and sometimes when I was interviewing them, I referred to them as donors. And the first thing that they always said, wait, before we go on, we are partners, we are not donors, as you all know, this discourse. And that, of course, well, attracted our attention, and we looked a bit in the literature, as you all know, like where this partnership discourse came from. And a lot of academics have actually highlighted this, and Maudsley, with whom we have been working together also and has inspired us a lot, also came up with these conclusions. And according to us, we can actually identify 2 main principles. One principle is referring to the relevance of expertise, that actually the expertise of South cooperation providers is based on how they have dealt and addressed their own development challenges, and they're now sharing it with other countries. And the second bundle of principles refers to equal relationships. It refers to this solidarity-based mutual benefit, the no interference, the demand-drivenness, the sameness, as somebody was saying yesterday. And the interesting thing was that when we were doing in Malawi and also in Mozambique some little surveys among traditional donors and officials of the Malawian and Mozambican government, we asked them who has the most useful expertise to address the development challenges in this case in Malawi. In the traditional donors, I don't know if you can see it very well, but the traditional donors only mention traditional countries, donor countries. While we asked the same question to representatives of the Malawian government, and that are the red lines, and you will see that actually they mentioned China, India, and to a lesser extent Brazil. So there was a very different understanding of what these countries were doing. We did the same thing in Mozambique, and there you will see that Brazil really stood out amazingly. We asked also who has the most influence, who's most influencing the policy and the decision-making process in this case in Malawi. So the light red lines are still referring to the expertise of the Malawian government representatives, while you see the dark red lines representing like which of the donors and partners is influencing most of the policy. And what you will see is that not necessarily those who have the most expertise are perceived to influence the policy the most. So both of these things actually refer to, according to us, to this principle of relevant expertise on the one hand, and on the other hand, the equal relations. But if you delve a bit deeper into the literature on partnership, then you will see that actually already from the 1960s, partners in partnership is actually a very popular word in development cooperation. That's been used by a number of different actors influencing each other. You have now the global partnership also. So the question is this actually old wine in new bottles? What is actually new about these principles and how they have been implemented? So that was the next phase in our research. And what we could do is we could identify a number of case studies, really programs and projects, which we tried to look into depth and like how they came about. And we used a certain methodology. Our focus was on state-to-state development cooperation, so only these, and we focused only on Mozambique and Malawi, and on cooperation, capacity development cooperation projects of Brazil, India, and China in the health sector and agricultural sector. For the expertise principle, we deconstructed the capacity development methods. We looked at the outcome also, and then for the equal relationships principle, we looked at all the phases of the project cycle and who was involved, who had decision-making power, etc. Just to give you a feeling of like what kind of projects we were looking at, well, we looked at actually highly promoted, really flagship projects of India, China, or Brazil. They pop up in like all kinds of literature. They've been heavily promoted. For India, for example, you have the Pan-African E-Network, which is 200 to 300 million investment or cooperation project of the Indian government, connecting virtually hospitals and educational facilities in Africa with those in India. There's also a cotton project. For China, we also looked at malaria centers, like one of the speakers, Madalena, I think yesterday, at agricultural demonstration center in Malawi, at medical teams in Mozambique, etc. And for Brazil, we looked at a pharmaceutical factory, which is actually the biggest pharmaceutical factory in sub-Saharan Africa. It's set up by the Brazilian Corporation, and it's intended to produce drugs against HIV/AIDS. We also looked at some other programs. One of them is the strengthening of the National Health Institute and also a cotton program. And then there were also some trilateral projects. One is China DFID cooperation, agricultural technology transfer. It's in fisheries in Malawi, and happy to hear that Laila Buckley, who's here, actually evaluated after we did our research also the whole project, so she knows more about this. And for the United States, we looked at the Innovation Bridge program, which is also implemented with India in Malawi and a number of other countries. Now, we did a whole paper on deconstructing these capacity development methods. I'm not going to go into depth here, but it's important to say that actually all of them are based on own claimed domestic successes, because for some there is some discussion about that. Also interesting is that sometimes these approaches are conflicting. For example, all of the three countries, India, China, and Brazil, have capacity building projects in cotton. They all have different approaches. They use different techniques. They have different objectives, etc. The same goes for the produce or transfer of drugs. Also, the different countries have different approaches. Now, when we did this whole first part about like what is the capacity development method, etc., we looked at the output. And interesting to see is like that all projects had like quite big output. Like there were infrastructure being built. There were classes being courses, visits, etc. That was all there. But the outcome, the effectiveness, the intended effectiveness of the cases, was much more debatable. And actually, we could identify 4 different types of outcomes. First of all, I know it's always difficult to compare with animals, but anyway, a cheetah. So there were successful projects which really had the intended outcome. For example, the National Health Institute strengthening of in Mozambique, carried out by Fiocruz of Brazil, was a very successful project and is still going on. He had some projects which we consider as turtles, like they were delayed. I mean, they had their outcome, for example, the Agri-TT program, but it was delayed. That happens, of course, in all development projects. We also had chameleons. That means like programs which completely changed. The intended outcome was very different from what was set in the beginning. And one of the best examples maybe is the Malaria Control Center, which was erected. There is a plaque somewhere in Mozambique, in Maputo, of this is the Malaria Control Center. But actually all the infrastructure, all the capacity building is actually happening somewhere else. Not always, the Chinese not always know what's happening with it, but actually it's come to good use, but it's not at all as it was intended to be. And then unfortunately, there were also some white elephants, like you also have in traditional development cooperation, of course. And the best example, the worst example of this is the Pan-African E-network of India. We've written a whole article about this, but actually it turned out that the output was there, all the machinery is there, but it's actually in Mozambique at least not in use at all. Now, we looked at how can we explain this lack of effectiveness in certain parts, in certain projects, and on the other hand, how can we explain the successes? Now, of course, there are a variety of reasons, but we look specifically at the role of agency and the role of this principle of equal relations. Could that actually explain it? Because the expertise was deemed to be relevant. So there it was actually quite nice. It was actually new wine, as you could say, in a new bottle. And we saw that in the most successful projects, for example, the National Health Institute, this is a quote of one of the people involved, of the Mozambican side. There we saw that the most successful projects, they were really based on African partners' needs assessment. There was really a demand, a request for a certain kind of assistance to one of the development providers, southern development providers. It was also integrated in an existing national strategy, and there was a shared vision, especially between the Brazilians and the Mozambican Health Institute. There is a shared vision of how actually health institution strengthening should go about. And importantly, all the relevant African actors were involved. So it's not only the highest levels, but actually also the people who have to implement and conceive the project were involved from the beginning. And it was a flexible implementation process. They could change along the route, and there was peer-to-peer implementation, which is actually in most projects, but there it was quite effective. The ones that actually didn't work out very well, there you could analyze the following, or identify the following factors. And what is an interesting quote, in my opinion, is of representatives of the Malawian government, Ministry of Agriculture, and when asked, why did you actually engage in this particular project? This was, I think, the cotton project of Brazil. Their answer was well, they came to us, and we say, well, let's just get it. So in other words, if you look at the demand-driven argument, it is more like you give a list. Sorry, China or India or Brazil is giving a list of possible cooperation projects, and then you just pick what is on the list, what is on the menu. So it's not, you can say it's a demand, but actually it's just like a reaction on a suggestion which is made. In a number of trilateral projects, what we saw is that from the beginning, the whole negotiation process took place among, on the one hand, the traditional donor, and on the other hand, the southern cooperation provider, or emerging country, as some people say. So the African part was only involved in a later stage. The Agri-TT project of China with Diffusion is a very good example of this. It was actually the UK who decided we want to work together with China. We're going to see how we're going to do that. We're going to use development cooperation a bit to do this. And then afterwards, we're going to involve Malawi. And now, as Laila, but she can say more about this, mentioned in a discussion, I hope maybe it's informal discussion. Apparently now the project is finished. It's not going to go through anymore. They're not going to prolong it because the FID is actually not intending to work anymore with China anymore. So there goes the project. And also another issue in this failed, let's say, project is that only the highest level of the African government are involved in each of the stages or in a number of stages. And that also goes back to the whole principle of no interference. You could see that in all projects that indeed China, nor Brazil, nor India is interfering. Oh, I have to put it somewhere else. Is interfering in the decision-making process on the ground. But that also means that they're also not interfering in who should be involved in the negotiation process. And then the last part is the blueprint project approach. We saw that in the Pan-African e-network, you see that in the agricultural demonstration center, you see that in the malaria control center. It's actually a one-size-fits-all. Wherever you go, we actually put this kind of project, and it should work everywhere. Now, as a conclusion, actually the conclusions, and I warn you, they're not wow conclusions, not at all. You're not going to be, wow, this is something new that I learned today. It's actually something which is going on in development cooperation for the last 30, 40 years, I mean, from the beginning. And it's the same for South-South cooperation. So in that sense, it's just the same wine, or beer if you prefer that, as always. The first thing of the conclusion is that South-South capacity building in our research, and that is another, I didn't go so much into this now, but that's part of another article, is indeed based on relevant knowledge or expertise. So that is actually quite something new, a new expertise which is brought into the field. But the agency of the African partner determines the effectiveness of South-South cooperation building. And actually the agency of any part in any project actually is the same thing. So this is not the wow conclusion. We might add to that the agency of the relevant African partner determines the effectiveness, because indeed the no interference principle says like we're not going to engage in who's going to be involved. So if it's the highest levels, it's all fine. Then the negotiations are between the highest levels. But actually what we saw in a lot of these projects, the people who had to implement it were actually not involved at all in the failed, let's say, projects. Okay, thank you very much.
We're setting a good precedent for the day by being on time all the way. So now let me turn to Professor Lina Ben Abdallah to explore this interesting relationship between technical skills transfer and norm diffusion.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Professor Broudigam and the CARI, CARI team for all the work to put this together. So essentially, what I would like to talk about today is research that has started as my dissertation work, but also building on it. So in starting to think and work on my dissertation about China-Africa relations, I had come to realize that a lot of the way that China's investments in Africa are talked about both in the media and in a lot of scholarship, usually when you hear the word investments and when we talk about China's investments in Africa, it really tends to be a lot about this hard kind of infrastructure, about construction projects, about investments in railways, about sort of these are basically the images that one finds when researching or looking at China's investments. However, what was missing in this and what was really interesting to me was these investments in a different type of infrastructure. This is sort of an infrastructure about building connections that are not through construction projects, but these are investments in human resource developments, investments in people that are built on people-to-people exchanges, and investments in professionalization training. So I would like to caveat that in sort of what I talk about in professionalization training programs here, I don't only mean capacity building programs that are provided by Chinese companies or Chinese factories which open up businesses in different African countries and they train labor to work in those factories specifically. So I'm not talking about only capacity building programs, say for a Huawei plant or for a factory that's going to open in Addis Ababa and it needs labor, so it's going to train labor so it works for that company. I'm more talking about professionalization trainings, which most of the time happen at the level of civil servants, at the level of sort of state and government officials. And so what we know about these professionalization trainings is obviously, without going into too much detail and showing that they are a big part of the China-Africa relations, they really are. So the numbers of these usually Chinese government-sponsored professionalization trainings increase every year. And we also see them as important and central, not just to China-Africa relations, but also they figure as an important part of also the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's something that China is carrying out, not just in its relationship to Africa, but also in other regions and in other states. So what do we know about these professionalization trainings? Obviously, there's been quite a few policy briefs coming out of CARI that looked at these professionalization trainings that I wanted to bring up here. A lot of my own dissertation work and findings were congruent with some of the main points brought up in a lot of these policy briefs, including the fact that, briefly speaking, professionalization trainings are usually span a wide variety of expertise. So we're talking about, all the way from Air Force pilots to civil servants who work or traditional medicine practicing experts. So we're talking about a whole wide variety of expertise here. They are mostly held in China. A lot of these professionalization trainings include bringing African staff and civil servants to China for the trainings, but not all of them are. So depending on the context, depending on what the training is about, sometimes it requires being in the context. So if you take a look, for example, at private security trainings, they usually have to happen on the context because you have to really cater the training to what the demands of the context are. In many ways, in agriculture as well, sometimes they have to, some of these trainings have to speak to the climate, they have to speak to the context where they're hosted, so they could happen. And they tend to be hosted in African countries for that specific reason. But most of them are usually held in China. Like I explained also, some of them can be a few days, a few weeks, so they can be a few months as well. So really the duration of the trainings varies depending on what the training is about. What's really, and like I mentioned there, they also are held in different languages, obviously catering to the different parts and regions of Africa. What's kind of really interesting, and I like to focus on this idea of the training, the professionalization trainings, including or incorporating an element of touring China. So the idea is that the participants in these trainings are invited to China and most of the time the tours include sort of experiences of going around to different provinces and different cities in China and being exposed to the narrative of, 30 years ago, this is where the city used to be, and now you could see the impact of development. And so that experiential impact of looking at sort of experiencing China's development success story firsthand is really important, and I'll come back to this after. So if there was one thing in common, even between delegations that are brought to China for professionalization trainings, from the military all the way to different other areas, the commonality was this aspect of taking delegations on tours to sort of see the impact of China's success development story, right? So that is something that I'll come back to. As I mentioned before, I kind of wanted to go beyond the material constructions, go beyond the cement of these investments, and look at investments in sort of the intangibles, or investments in these people-to-people relations, investments in professionalization trainings. Obviously, in my research, as I said, I took a thematic approach. I did a lot of interviews and engaged in participant observation for a lot of these workshops that took place in Beijing. And I've talked to a lot of African delegates who were taking part of these, were participating in these trainings. And so I took a thematic approach. I looked at the media trainings, I looked at security-based trainings, I looked at agriculture-based trainings. And then after sort of taking in a lot of these empirics and a lot of this data, I wanted to step out for a minute and think about what this means. So think about the bigger picture. So what story am I going to tell with all of these professionalization trainings? And so here's where sort of the theoretical framework or the thinking about the norm diffusion sort of came about. without sort of having to go to explaining sort of what exactly is the return of this investment, right? So that question is always, asked, right? So when it's easier to assess an investment in a factory or in, say, in infrastructure, because you can just see how it's used, how useful it is, and then you can make, assessments based on how successful the investment was. But when it comes to these professionalization trainings, it's a little bit difficult to actually have an understanding of what is the point, what does China get out of it? So there's always this question. But even if I cannot answer that question, I can pay attention to it, saying that, as I said, the numbers keep increasing, right? That there's a lot of interest in these professionalization trainings, and they are not just China-Africa related, but now if you look at the BRI, a lot of it is focusing on these professionalization trainings. So there is an interest in this there. Obviously, the literature that I examine for this, when it comes to sort of normative change, when it comes to these ideas, exchanges of ideas, so when we talk about, say, why do navies, for example, do drills together, right? So the importance of doing joint drills in many ways, or in the literature, it's not just because of photo op or just because to say, there are close relations. No, well, actually the exchange of ideas, thinking about the concept of threat, thinking about security, thinking about the way to respond to these, becomes sort of joint. So there's an exchange, there's a dialogue. So there's a lot of experience that gets exchanged through these professionalization trainings. That's not just about, rhetorical photo op, we're good friends and we're moving on, right? So there's a lot going on there about this idea of knowledge production, this idea of understanding what it means, what is the concept of threat, how to respond to it. These have practical consequences. However, when we think about these sort of normative and ideational changes, in the literature, oftentimes there's a lot of literature that talks about sort of, thinking about global south countries and developing countries as the recipients and the consumers of norms, of international norms. And oftentimes the literature, the way that it's set up, it evaluates these developing countries. Have they been doing good at being integrated in the international system as it is, right? So the idea is that they are, whether they're a good student, mediocre student, or a bad student. And so there are a lot of assumptions connected to that literature that essentially developing countries or global south countries are on the kind of receiving end of normative change. However, there's been a little bit, up and rising literature that tries to think about rising powers as perhaps not just challengers of norms, but also norm makers and norm builders. Of course, I refer to Dan Large and Chris Alden's 2015 article, because to me that was very much the first instance where we are talking about China and that grapples with China as a norm maker. And in my dissertation, in my research, in fact, I don't even ask the question whether there are norms being diffused, because to me it sounds like it cannot be normal if there were no norms. I mean, there's no way that there are no norms being exchanged and diffused in a relationship like this in the past 10 to 15 years, including China as this huge actor in the continent. There's no way that there are not norm exchanges. So instead of asking the question whether there are norms being diffused or there are norms being, the question becomes, what kind of norms, what are they, right? So how are they pushed back against? What is African agency in order to, the sort of the two-way, the highway, sort of what Dan said yesterday. So what is this kind of feedback loop about norms that are being diffused? The debate or the question in my mind is not whether there are norm diffusions in this relationship. There's no way that there isn't. But the question is, what are these norms? How are they diffused? And in my mind, looking at these professionalization trainings provides us a space to see them as these conveyors, as these places for this dialogue to happen, this exchange of expertise, this exchange of... one of the norms that I explore in my research, and something that Dan talked about yesterday, is this idea of security and economic growth and economic development being merged together. So the idea that in order to achieve peace and peace building, so when you're thinking about peacekeeping, peace building, the idea is to prioritize economic growth, right? So not necessarily democratic values, not necessarily governance issues, but more so looking at development first. This is not a Chinese-made norm, but it's a Chinese-led norm, and it's a different way of looking at the relationship between security and development from the usual sort of the neoliberal peace approach, right? And one of the ways that this norm sort of, in my mind, gets projected is through these professionalization trainings, and China provides a lot of professionalization trainings for peacekeepers, right? For peacekeepers from African countries and elsewhere. And if you think about China's own contribution to peacekeeping missions in the UN, most of the time, the majority is non-combat troops, right? And a lot of them are engineers, a lot of them are experts in health, in development, so they are tasked with paying attention to development, not to empower civil society or to look at good governance measures or to try to democratize or have free and fair elections or observe any of that. So the idea here is, my argument is that China is not necessarily creating a huge new global world order and it's, a threat to think about it from that perspective, but it's actually that it's sort of using the mechanisms and the institutions that already exist, but reinterpreting sort of parts of that system differently, right? Reframing it, reinterpreting it differently. And in many ways, so peacekeeping is not the creation of China, but focusing on development rather than all of these normative, democratic, and liberal peace norms is the difference that China brings to place. And I really want to echo what a lot of my colleagues have been saying yesterday and this morning here, is that really there's no blueprint here. So when we talk about China-led norms, we're not saying, China is creating something and sort of feeding it or forcing it on others, but the idea is that there is variance across African governments and across African countries based on the kind of governance, the kind of structure, the kind of the level of institutions, and cases differ and vary largely, based on a lot of the presentations made here and in my own research. So essentially, I did not, get the chance to really explain a lot of the different themes that I looked at, but the idea was essentially that I take professionalization trainings to be these spaces for dialogue and exchange, to think about the way that Chinese-led norms, and in many ways they actually enmesh naturally, right? In many ways they are close or closer to the experiences of African governments and African civil servants, closer than their experiences that they have, say from the traditional powers or traditional trainings that they receive in other countries. So I'll leave it at here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you. So I sense that we will continue with this discourse on what happens around ideas. In this case, it's the ideas around sustainable self-development in relation to health diplomacy, for which we hear from Professor Paul Cadets.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much, Professor Brodeghem, and especially Marie and the rest of the committee. Marie, who did amazing work. I'm really impressed. I just did a conference, and she really outdid me by far. So this is very interesting to follow your talk, because I actually found something quite different in the sector of health diplomacy. So this was funded, this research, when I was a faculty member at Qianjiao Liverpool University in Suzhou. And it ends up in this book I co-edited, Handbook of Welfare in China. And so we'll start out with defining what health diplomacy is. It may have been done yesterday. My methodology, the structure of Sino-African health diplomacy, the findings of health aid specifically to Madagascar, which is where I did my research, and any recommendations. And you are all familiar, I'm sure, with Joseph Nye's definition of soft power, which health diplomacy would definitely fall in the category of soft power. But we could also look at diplomacy and health diplomacy in particular using Marcel Maus's theory of the gift, and the idea that the gift is really a crossing of a threshold into a relationship often of indebtedness that is bound through webs of obligation, which sounds very similar to the idea of guanxi. So health diplomacy can be considered any healthcare activity characterized by underlying intention of improving political, economic, and I cannot read this. Okay. And or political ties between donor and recipient countries in keeping with the foreign policy of the donor state. Unfortunately, I did not memorize that. So when you look at normative OECD DAC, health diplomacy, you're usually thinking about its starting point in the Truman Doctrine after World War II, and especially the idea of high technology health transfers, specifically in health as well, but transfers in general of technology. And this is slightly different from the Chinese theory of development, and this has been critiqued, the OECD DAC normative development, by several, especially anthropologists, including Arturo Escobar. But what I was fascinated with was Dambisa Moyo's thesis in Dead Aid, where she was actually mainly critiquing the idea that development often leads to corruption in African states, and especially I was fascinated with the idea of, and this is not a new idea that she came up with, but of dependency, and that there is specifically a creation of dependency with development. And so I was wondering specifically in the health sector, is that true? Was aid really creating dependency in the health sector? And so these were my research questions based on Moyo's thesis that I tried to understand, and this was my methodology. And I basically used approximately 200 semi-structured interviews with a targeted sample of government employees and healthcare workers and Chinese medical teams and patients in Chinese hospitals. And so, as been mentioned, I'm sure already, about the idea of a mutual sister development between China and other countries. This idea, which was attempting to be challenging to the normative idea of Western development, was developed in the Bandung Conference of 1955 in Bandung, Indonesia. And in 1964, Zhou Enlai proposed that both the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and the 8 principles of economic aid are what should be incorporated into all development projects. And what was valuable about this was, as I'm sure has been mentioned, the idea of the mutuality of the benefits that come with aid. Well, if we look specifically at the healthcare sector, historically, what we can see is the building of infrastructure. And primarily what we see in China aid is horizontal, primary focused healthcare that is bilateral. And so there's building of infrastructure, there is the development of drugs, the production of drugs. China is the capital for API, which is the active ingredient of many generic drugs for India, who packages the drugs. And China has been very helpful in the production, as I believe someone's already mentioned, of drugs, herbal remedies for malaria, and they're developing herbal remedies for HIV. But what has been prominent in China, Sino-African health diplomacy are the CMTs, or the Chinese medical teams, who run a course of approximately 2 years and are replaced every 2 years by another medical team. And this is a bilateral agreement that is twined between a province in China and an African state. And so if we look at what President Xi Jinping announced in 2015 at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Johannesburg. China now has the technology, equipment, professional, and skilled personnel and capital needed to help Africa realize sustainable self-development. And so I really wanted to see, is this true? Because this runs slightly contrary, even though Dambisa Moyo does speak of China as offering a different possibility. I wanted to see if this was true. And this was actually, this was like bizarre to see in Madagascar coming from China, but this is where the workers who were building the hospital were living. So a few points about Madagascar in terms of the Human Development Index. It's 151 out of 187 countries. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. Less than 2.65% of Malagasy GDP is going to the healthcare sector, which is well below what some other countries are putting into the healthcare sector, which results in over 80% of healthcare sector funding coming from outside. And this can be very problematic. And on top of this, there's a double burden of communicable and non-communicable diseases. So this was from the Ministry of Health. The health system is not well implemented. 80% of Malagasy live in rural areas, and 40% live more than 20 kilometers from any health facility. There are no laboratories in remote areas. Hospitals are very far away from the rural person. As a result of accessibility, 80% of mothers and children die within their own communities. So it's a rather bleak situation, and in this case, the 4 hospitals that were built since 1975 with the Gansu province and Madagascar have really been needed. I looked at one particular hospital, and primarily what I saw was extremely low drug pricing of both local Malagasy drug products and herbal products, as well as a plethora of Chinese herbal products, as you can see here. And there also was, outside of the regular medical team, there was acupuncture that was being offered. And they were using, I'm also an acupuncturist, and they were using needles I would never use. They were, really quite large, thick needles, which is more common in China than in many other countries. But the patients loved it. And the patients, several patients that I interviewed were cited for saying, this is magic, it is doing magical things to my body, nothing else has helped but this. And some patients were traveling as far away as 600 kilometers just for the treatment, and partly because it was the most cost-effective treatment in all of Madagascar. So in many ways, it was competing with the Malagasy healthcare system. However, there were some issues. And the 4 major issues that I found that when I was looking specifically at is the way that China is doing health diplomacy in Madagascar, really promoting self-sustainability. And I found these four issues. First, they're the CMTs, the fact that the CMTs go to the same areas over and over and over again, and I did not find any training going on for local healthcare practitioners, actually serves to disincentivize the government from replacing them and from dealing with this issue where typically Malagasy doctors do not want to go to these rural areas where the hospitals are located. And so in many ways, something that looks like it is irrefutable and positive is actually creating a dependency situation. Second, there was a lack of a transfer of administrative and managerial skills. And this was really seen in the new hospitals. I showed you a brand new hospital there where all the equipment is from China and it's written in Chinese. And so, and there's usually not a lot of translation that is going on so that the local workers know how to work these machines. So this is creating dependency where the Chinese are constantly needed to come in and change whatever's needed for the machine, but also there have been agreements where every machine that's in the hospital must be replaced by a Chinese machine. And so, you could consider that this can add up when you're looking at MRIs and CAT scans, et cetera. But also importantly, in terms of the Chinese medical teams, there was never any debriefing from one team in 1 year to another, so that you were constantly reinventing the wheel and starting from scratch. This is really problematic, and I questioned the director in Beijing who was overseeing this, and he didn't see this as an issue. The fourth thing was, I consider the most important thing, and it's that the Gansu province was working directly with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they were bypassing the Ministry of Health. And in bypassing the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Health was not able to even oversee any of these projects. And this was not unusual. I mean, USAID was doing the same thing. JICA, to a certain extent, was doing the same thing. But China absolutely refused to work with the Ministry of Health. And they also were not working collaboratively with local NGOs who really were looking for Chinese help. And this created a bit of a problem. And part of that may be the idea of respecting sovereignty and not engaging in local civil society, which is also an issue domestically in China. So these are a few quotes that come from some of the ministers that I speak to. We don't know what we need because we've never been given, and this isn't specifically to China, this is in general, because we've never been given the opportunity to assess our needs. In other words, they're being, told what to do. Foreign aid is not always what we want. The problem is that we always accept it even if we don't need it. Donors already have their fixed ideas, and to give to those whom they give, or to give what they can give. This situation isn't necessarily useful to the Malagasy, but more importantly, the Malagasy do not know what they need. This is repeating what the other minister said, because they're never given the opportunity to figure out what they need. Nobody asks us. So this is very similar to what you were saying as being problematic. The development policy of Madagascar is sectoral. NGOs carry out their acts in sectors according to their capabilities, but this results in siloed interventions. In order to promote sustainable development in each sector concerned, NGOs should be interconnected and work together. In other words, they should be multi-sectoral. If I had to visualize what was happening in the healthcare sector in China, you would have a patch quilt of different interventions, and that really often were not even needed in that area, for example. So we could say that what was happening was almost a decentralization, not internally, but externally to the outside donors and funders. And that what resulted from this decentralization was a fragmentation of the healthcare system, not a building or a strengthening of the capacity of the healthcare system. And this is in direct contradiction to both the Paris Declaration and the Accra Agenda for Action, which strongly, can I use this? Yes, strongly focuses on building local capacity for taking over. So this is my horrible attempt at, I have no artistic capabilities whatsoever, but what we see here is that's needed is that this relationship needs to be resolved, and that you really need a much more equal relationship between the funder and the Ministry of Health. And the Ministry of Health really needs to be involved. And you also need to have a relationship between the funders and the INGOs, as well as the local NGOs, which from many local NGOs that I interviewed, they really were seeking this and were not included. And so I want to thank you for your attention.
Now let's turn to Q&A. Interesting beginning of the morning, multiple themes, and let's see. I'll take 3 questions at a time. Maria, are you the roving mic? So 1, 2, and behind you 3.
Hi, I'm Barney Walsh from the African Leadership Centre. I had a question for Mr. Makundi, but that other people might know about this as well. Specifically in Tanzania or anywhere else you've looked at, there's technology transfer, is there anything at all going on with what I'd call futures technology, like 3D printing, artificial intelligence, tactile communications in health, that kind of thing? Or is this all still about manufacturing, agriculture, and that kind of thing?
Second one was there.
Lila Buckley from IAD. I have a question about the theme of relevant African actors. This is both for Tom and Paul. First, to Paul, just maybe clarification. You said that the Chinese weren't willing to work with the Ministry of Health, which is, maybe I didn't understand that, or it's
Could you
surprising
say that again?
to
I
me
didn't hear your question.
that the Chinese team was not willing to work with the Ministry of Health, which is somewhat surprising to me. Not surprising that they weren't willing to work with NGOs, but maybe clarification on that, and then reflection on the question for Tom is related to Agri-TT. One of the reflections that came out of my lesson learning study at the end of the project was that DFID expressed frustration that the Chinese had this requirement that they had to work through the governments of Malawi and Uganda, that was really primary for them in the partnership, and that DFID would have preferred, maybe on the implementation side, to involve NGOs more. So you focused on this idea that finding the appropriate partners is really key to successful projects. I'm wondering if both of you could reflect a little bit more on that point.
Okay. Let's take these from panelists who want to respond.
On technology transfer in relation to the future tech and high tech, I didn't encounter any particular project, for example, involving a Chinese partnership in that particular domain. But on the case of Chinese scholarship, where, of course, I also did a research on, there were in situations where trainees were equipped with skills which are in that kind of direction, like very high-tech or futuristic kind of technology. And what came out of it is that they had a view that it was problematic for them because they gained skills which were not really relevant for their institutions, and it was very difficult for them to implement or to apply the skills which they gained because it was too advanced and their institutions were not willing to invest in applying those skills.
Who was next?
You want to start?
You want to go, Tom?
Okay, I can.
Yeah.
It's, okay. This was from the former Ministry of Health and the current Minister of Health, and the current Minister of Health, as well as the former one. And they were both, as well as several other people I interviewed. And what I was told was that China only worked in Madagascar with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And not only did they bypass the Ministry of Health, but USAID was starting to work with INGOs that were just really kind of only doing the minimal amount of what they had to do to say where they were doing their project. And, you know, basically the Ministry of Health, the ministers of health said, our hands are tied. What can we really do about this? the reason the people gave is because they felt the Ministry of Health was so corrupt that they did not want to give any money or engage with the Ministry of Health. But, to me, that's like saying, the indigenous people are too ignorant to change. It's the same notion. And so everyone echoed this, and I found it, problematic because nothing's going to change until you engage the Ministry of Health and work with them if they do have issues with management to overcome that. But that's what I found.
Tom?
Well, regarding the question on IPTT, so my research focused not only on state-to-state cooperation, and the thing was that all the projects that I looked at involved the states, the government, in this case of Malawi or of Mozambique. Now, what happened was that in a number of case studies, what you could see that there was frustration with the people who had to implement these projects, being either from the Malawian government or Mozambican, or from the Indian implementers, or Chinese, or Brazilian, or even if there was a trilateral cooperation from one of the trilateral partners, in the sense of like that they were saying like that sometimes the regulations in the bureaucracy and the negotiation process at higher levels is actually impeding them to do what they want to do. And that can go in a lot of different directions. For example, for the Brazilians, it was that the Brazilian regulation does not allow to donate money directly from Brazil to African or other countries. So, for example, if you had a pharmaceutical factory and there was something wrong there, then the Brazilians who are implementing the project in Mozambique, they could not just say like, yeah, we need this kind of tube or whatever, because they had to go through a whole process to actually get that kind of money because it was not allowed. For the Indians, for example, the Pan-African E-Network there, the people who were implementing it, the Indian person who is implementing it, did a very good job, as acclaimed by everyone, but the problem was that every monitoring or evaluation report they were sending back to the government in India was actually not looked upon. So the thing is that I didn't hear of lots of people saying like we want to work with NGOs, except for the Brazilians, because in Brazil you also have a very bigger debate going on of like how to include or not include, and what is the role of NGOs and civil society in the whole development cooperation process, because there's also a lot of critique also on what Brazil is doing in Africa. For India, it was very different, and for China, it was even more different. Actually, there was not so mention of that. Then for the question of trilateral, a very nice question, but I didn't look into that. So if I would say something now, it would be so superficial that it might be wrong. So what we did do in another research, which I think is also very interesting, is looking at cooperation between civil society organizations from the South. So, for example, Brazilians working with Indonesian actors in Africa and looking at that. And that actually is a very different ball game, which I think is the whole principles of equal relationships, etc., really come about there much better than in the state-to-state development cooperation. But anyway, that's not an answer to your question. That's an answer to a question that I can answer. So.
Great. Thanks. So let's take another cycle. I'd like especially to include questions on the very interesting presentation on norm diffusion. I have one in the background, but we see hands. Deborah, then there, and then there.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Another great panel. I have a booming voice. Okay. Thank you for another great panel. It's really been wonderful. So I have some quick questions and some short reflections, which I will make really short. Everyone did a wonderful job. Hezron, it's just great to have you back here. And I remember this Tanzania submission of the special economic zone proposal, and I wondered whether you or anyone else has looked further into that, because it's with the Bagamoyo port, there's a really interesting possible connections there. So just a thought on that. Let's see, Tom, that was great. That was fascinating. I loved your animals, so keep those in. In particular, I was fascinated by the slide in which you talked about the different responses by the traditional donors and the government in terms of who was helping. I thought that was really fascinating. And I wondered if you brought those findings back to the traditional donors to see what they, to see how they reflected on that, because I think that would be really interesting to see what happened there. Lena, I really want you to come to the Department of Defense with me and Dan Large and do a presentation there. I'm actually serious, so let's do that. I think that it would be really, really interesting. I think they'd be interested too. So I'll just stop there with that. And Paul, it was really fascinating. And I was going to pick up on exactly the same thing that Lila already asked you. But let me just say that apropos of this approach to the working with the Ministry of Health or not, the medical teams are the oldest dinosaur in the Chinese panoply of dinosaurs in their foreign aid program. So they really are. They were the first thing that they did. And they're the ones that haven't changed the most. I mean, they have changed the least to make that. And so I just think that's really interesting that you picked up on that. And that's really, it's very insightful. And I would frame it within that context, that it's really a dinosaur, badly needs to change. I've actually been saying that to them. And we can talk more about that because I have some reflections also about about that. But we can do that in the researchers' workshop. Thank you.
Hi, Martina Bassan, PhD candidate at Sciences Po Paris. So I have a question for you, Professor Lina Benabdallah. I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about the content of these training programs. And also, I don't know if you have looked to other kind of training programs, like business training programs for African businessmen. I know there's an institute in Zhejiang, and it has been set up from Zhejiang University, Normal University, which is supervised by the old ambassador for special affairs to Africa. And so I was wanting to know a little bit more about that. And also just something it's not really a question, but since we've been talking about norm diffusions and expertise and so on, I just wanted to say that Dead Aid, the book that you mentioned, Professor Cadet, is actually one of the few books that has been completely translated into Chinese and and it has been translated also by a university in China, Zhejiang Normal University, by the way. So it could be interesting in terms of, what kind of knowledge they take and they diffuse into intellectual and the academic realm, and how that can be extended to norms diffusion. So thank you.
Right here. Sorry. Yang No-yoon, Foundation for Empowerment. Tom and Helen, I have questions about the sort of this Brazil and India and coming in. Then does that give the opportunities to the African governments to choose the different investors who can even transfer technology better, not only dependent on China? That's my first question. Second, Lina, this is really fascinating. And I have to say, when I actually interviewed the Korean policymakers in 1980s, when I was in 1990s, when I was working for the World Bank, they said that they came to the EDI, former World Bank Institute. They came to the EDI program, which is very similar to what you are describing. Then there was a really such an elite program that when they went back to Korea, they had the EDI club. So, here my question is, okay, this is people don't take it only unilaterally. Africans are very smart, so they can interpret and all these things. But for me, my question is, how effective it is, in the sense that what kind of image the African government officials and others feel about China, and what is the actual impact of those things to Chinese image about Africans? I heard so much about Chinese are very much complaining about African students, louder and whatever. Then the African students talking about so I'm sorry to make. Then my last question.
No, I'm going to have to stop you.
Okay, then I will finish here. Okay.
Please, let's take those three.
Okay. The export processing zone authority. So the one actually which Deborah questioned about is a more recent one. So initially when Chinese government pledged to build EPZA in Africa, Tanzania submitted a proposal, and that was supposed to be fully funded by the Chinese government, and that didn't work out. But then there was another one which was much bigger. Actually, it was a 10 billion, and it involved EPZA and Port of Bagamoyo. And this was an initiative actually of President Kikwete, and it's very interesting because then Bagamoyo is like a hometown for President Kikwete. And the project was actually going to be like in a trilateral way. So the Tanzanian government actually brought together the Omanis and Chinese. So it was going to be a trilateral project involving the Tanzanian government, Oman, and Chinese. And it was going to be very huge. So EPZ, port, and other infrastructural activities. What bring the interesting story of complexity of urgency in this particular story is that the justification for the Bagamoyo port was that the Dar es Salaam port was highly congested. The getaway of the cargo from Dar es Salaam was passing through the city center, and this was being problematic. So they said we need a different port. But then Bagamoyo is only like less than 100 miles from Dar es Salaam. So the new government came in and they felt like, yeah, we can do something about the Dar es Salaam port without building a new port. So there is a change of direction that it feels like the Magufuli government is not really interested in this kind of a new project. And of course, there's a lot of other stories behind some corruption behind the entire project in terms of land in Bagamoyo acquisition and all these kinds of stories. So it brings a lot of complexity in terms of urgency, government decisions, and things like that. And up to this point, we are not sure if it's going to take off or not. Yeah.
Thanks. Tom?
Regarding the question of whether they could choose among their investors, etc., between Brazil, India, and China. Well, again, I only looked at state-to-state cooperation. What we saw is that in Malawi, for example, there was no strategy of the government. So whatever they took, they could get, to put it very blunt and oversimplified, but it actually was not incorporated in the bigger strategy of like, we're going to go with this or this donor or partner. And plus the fact that actually the traditional donors, their weight is much, much higher than actually India, China, and Brazil combined. So we really don't have to overemphasize the importance, at least in the time that I was doing this research. What you could see in Mozambique, where the ballgame was a bit different, because in the Ministry of Health, the person who was responsible for certain projects was a very strong person. He really knew what he wanted. And what he did is actually he negotiated. Like, he looked like, okay, Brazil is actually better for these things than India or than China. So actually there you had a very big agency of this person within the National Health Institute. So, but that was quite interesting, was really like person-based, because if it might be someone else, it might be different. Then regarding the question of Deborah, for the little graphs that we showed in the surveys, indeed, like part of the whole research was that we went back with these graphs to the traditional donors in the South cooperation providers. And to my surprise, actually, they weren't surprised. They were surprised in the sense that, we didn't mention them, but they weren't insulted, because it's more like, because I mean, certain things come out. For example, I think it was EU or USAID who come out as like having no expertise at all, but influencing decision-making process to a very big extent. So I thought they're not going to be very happy to see this. And they looked at it and they said, okay, I mean, we understand it, we have to do something about it. The most funny thing was the FAO, which actually came out as very good in terms of expertise. I was the only one that had more expertise according to the Malawian government than Brazil and India and China. They thought that we would do that every 2 years. So actually they asked us for the last 10 years, all the surveys, because they went back to Rome with these things to actually say, like, listen, what kind of nice work we're doing here. But they also looked at it as a kind of opportunity to say, like, actually, we indeed completely underestimate the power or the role of China, India, and Brazil, and we're not coordinating with them at all for different reasons. That's another story. So, yeah.
Bina?
Yes, so I think the questions were very good and they speak to one another, so I'll take them together in the sense of what's the content of the training programs and how they are received or viewed. So the content of these trainings really is diverse, depending on, obviously, the area of expertise. There are a few things that are in common. A lot of the training programs have a component on China's history, Chinese culture. The idea is that there's a point made to expose participants to Chinese culture, to make them understand China's history and culture better. And I have actually looked at a curriculum from a school that was training African journalists to see, and I looked at the syllabi, I was curious also, like what goes into these trainings. I was also curious to see what happens. And it was kind of interesting because the syllabus kind of looked like almost any average syllabus that you would find in a journalism or media class, pretty much at the University of Florida, which is where I was doing my PhD at the time, and I compared it to. There were a few changes, or the differences were in the components of the syllabus that talked about history, Chinese history, that talked about some ideologies sort of behind thinking about the relationship between sort of authorities and journalism. So that was a little bit different. In terms of the other thing, the theme that I looked at was the peacekeeper trainings. I've only looked at on the spot the kind of trainings that happen are really rudimentary kind of development work type of things. So it was not this summer, hopefully, and the research that I'm working on now is about looking at training peacekeepers in China, right? So there are academies that are tasked with training peacekeepers from Africa in China, so you'll have to stay tuned for findings from that. But overall, I actually, even in the workshops that I've attended, and I talked to different African participants in these workshops, many of them actually would complain that the content did not really matter so much, or did not bring anything new, or was not very successful, especially when it comes to completely different context, and then what you learn, the skills that you have, may or may not necessarily apply when you take it back to your context. So even in those instances when the content of the trainings were not particularly efficient, the experience overall of the participants in these training programs was very positive. And the idea is this encouragement and this attraction to China's development model and to the success story of the development of China, and helped with the tours, helped with the idea of seeing firsthand and experiencing firsthand the difference that the last 3 decades have made in China, and sort of that boosts a little bit sort of the image. So that was common, and what was really interesting to see. So even when the content was not successful or did not seem to be efficient, the experience itself made a big difference and made a positive impact. So there's something about that. There's something to say about that. So.
Paul, was something to you?
Sure. So yes, it is a dinosaur. It's dating back to 1964. And I would say that looking historically at health diplomacy, and even the work of the Rockefeller Foundation in the early part of the 20th century, that health is in many ways the ultimate Trojan horse for making these relationships and for making these, be it economic webs or political economic or political ecologic relationships and webs. And so, and it's been very successful, health diplomacy, at doing that. And so I think it is surprising, looking in retrospect, when I was speaking with the director of these programs in Beijing, and I said, so is there any debriefing from one 2-year team to the next? And he said, no. And I said, oh, well, does that work okay? You know, and supposedly it works okay, but to me that's somewhat reinventing the wheel. But no, that doesn't change, and it is rather fascinating when you think about it. And the book, Dembizo Moyo's book, you know, I have the image in mind of Ronald Reagan walking around with Milton Friedman's book. And this is a bit of a parallel when you see Xi Jinping walking around with Dembizo Moyo's book, because there was a chapter on China and how China offered these possibilities, these great possibilities. And of course, she was not looking specifically at health diplomacy. But I have to put in a disclaimer. This is one country, and this is one sector in one country. And so can that be generalized? Am I saying something in general about China and Africa? Actually, no. It's a case study, and it's a case study at a particular time, in a particular place, in a particular health sector of health. So I just need to clarify that, you know, if it seems that other countries, for example, have China working with their Ministry of Health, that may be the case. The Ministry of Health is now so weak in Madagascar that there isn't any pushback about it, as you saw in the quotes.
I think we have time for one more cycle of 4 urgent questions. Anything in that back corner of the room that's quiet? No? Let's come this way. 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2.
There's 2.
Please.
My name's June Sun. I'm an Africa Middle East technology analyst based in London. My first question is for Lena. So I found the idea of norm diffusion really interesting, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the power dynamics and the power inequality in these sites, and if you saw any diffusion from the African side to China at all. And my second question is to Hezron, and I was curious to find out more about, in these negotiations, did you see any intentionality? Was it opportunistic more, or was there a plan for what exactly they wanted to get out of these negotiations? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Yanning. I'm a PhD student here at SAIS, and I guess this question is kind of open up to the panel. I'm very interested in the host government's agency and capacity in technology transfer. So I just want to kind of pull that concept out, and I would be very interested in like what your research found in that aspect. Like, for example, for Hezron, it would be how if you found any variations in Tanzania's government's ability to influence technology transfer to various extent, like maybe between like different actors. And for Lena, it would be if you found any variations among like the African government in their ability to influence the agenda of these professionalization training groups. And finally, like for Paul, whether it seems like there's very little capacity in the Madagascar case, but I was just wondering if there has been like some variations over time. And for Tom, specifically, if there were any difference between like the Malawi government versus the Mozambique government in their dealings among the 3 BRICS countries, if you found any variations there. Thank you.
3 third ones here. And the 4th one is back there.
Hi, Julia Strauss, SOAS, the University of London. If we sort of telescope out, it seems to me that Tom and Paul on the one hand are sort of arguing, at least implicitly, well, pretty much China is subject to the same laws of gravity as anybody else in development, and that the mistakes are kind of the same, and possibly the things that are done well are pretty much the same as anywhere. So broadly speaking, Tom and Paul sort of getting to this idea. But Lena is suggesting something a little different, that China's actually trying to do something different with these trainings and being done in a particular kind of way. And so I was wondering if the panel in general could reflect a little bit on, is China simply the same as anybody else, or is there something going on here that's really quite different? Then just a very quick addition or comment for Lena. This whole question of trainings goes way, way back. in China goes back to the early 20th century, and both China in the PRC variant and China in the ROC Taiwan variant. You bring people to the center and you demonstrate your virtue, crudely. And it's not so much the content of the trainings, but the demonstration of how modern we are and how advanced we are that makes the big impression in both places.
Thank you. Final questions over
Thank
there.
you. My name is Hong. I'm from George Mason University, PhD student there. My question is to Lina too. I wonder, first of all, could you give us a little bit like a typical profile of these African officials or whatever? Who are they? Who are coming to China? And also, just by what you have just explained about the content of the trainings, it sounds to me a little bit more like I would probably characterize this propaganda more because they are not really talking about any substantive capacity building, but rather impress you about Chinese history, culture, and achievements. So I wonder maybe there's more that you haven't talked about, like in terms of hardcore capacity building. Do they talk about how the Chinese government work in terms of the administratorial type of training and these more, like these kind of things that could potentially transfer state capacity from China to the other countries? Thank you.
Thanks. So go down the panels. I'm going to add a little bit to that last question for you, Lina. I mean, I think many of us who've interacted have been struck at the disconnect between context and the relevance of training. And I'm wondering the degree to which in your research you discover that there's a self-awareness, that actually this context is so different that the practical training doesn't fit, but nonetheless, the purpose of norm diffusion is what's driving this. So just extending these. So let's go down the panel and then let's end. Hezron?
Okay, so if you could question now the engagement between Tanzania and China in terms of whether it is highly planned or it's opportunistic. Yeah, in one way, it's highly opportunistic in a way that there's a very strong move to pull in resources from China, whether in terms of investment or in terms of aid. But then in between, of course, there is a lot of complexity. So there is sometimes like conflicting interest, for example, between ministries and departments. At one point, of course, there was a proposal from the Tanzanian Investment Center to like have less conditions for Chinese investment. And then some other agencies were saying, but this will be like a preferential treatment to Chinese while we want investment from anywhere else in the world. And so it didn't move on. At the same time, sometimes you have individual interests. For example, there was one project of having like a big logistic hub of a Chinese company in Dar es Salaam at the area which was occupied by the locals, which is close to the Dar es Salaam port. And then there were some civil servants who discovered that project and they went to buy land from people there and they tried to inflate the compensation cost, and this bring a lot of chaos, and there was delay, and in the end, of course, the Chinese investor could not wait for the entire process to come on to invest on this project. So this actually happens, and the same way, of course, there are variations in sectors, and sometimes you could do interview and realize that actually the strength of that negotiation was actually based on a certain individual leader in a certain ministry or department or team. So it's really very rough, but yeah, of course, you could come up with some examples or some stories of successful negotiations. But in a number of cases, of course, it was or it came out to be driven by some individual strength and power, and not always it was for the national interest. Sometimes for individual, sometimes ethnic, regional, and the other interests were also in play in terms of driving this negotiation process. Thank you.
Well, to just answer your question or reflect on your point, the thing is that, well, of course, like we did the research. Oh, sorry. So I'm aware of like my position also within this research. Like I'm a Western from Belgium, going to interview people in Africa, in China, etc. So of course it has an enormous influence on how people reply to me, but also how I interpret the results, etc. So and that has to be taken into account. But to come back to your question, like I think on the one hand, what we try to do is we looked at these projects and we said like, okay, what was intended? What was their intended outcome? Like we would do also with other projects. Actually, you could almost say like the taxpayer, maybe, I don't know in China, but anyway, the taxpayer is paying money to set up certain projects, does the taxpayer get like, what is it, the return that it gets? And then in looking from that side, I think that the taxpayer is and also the recipient, etc., or the other partner is allowed to question like the outcome of this. And what we looked at is a big difference with your projects. Our projects for China were the demonstration center, whereas the Agri-TT project was the malaria control center in the medical teams. There were not so many projects who actually involved people who were sent out to China to take lessons or courses there. So that's a big difference in this. So you only looked at the outcome on the ground in Malawi and in Mozambique. And there for the Chinese projects, we came to the conclusion that there are some benefits. There are some other things which come out. But the intended outcome of some of these projects, at least, is very, very different. And then you can question, like, yeah, the money has to come from somewhere. Somebody has to pay for this. And is the person or the institution who pays for that, is that person or that institution or that actor, like, all right with saying, like, okay, maybe the money then goes to something else? That is something like that population has to... But anyway, big difference, I think, also with the different... Yeah. So.
Okay. All right. So to the question of power dynamics, I mean, there are a lot of power dynamics in this relationship in the sense that when we're talking about professionalization trainings, it's obviously hierarchical in that sense. So we're talking about a recipient African or a participant African and then an expert Chinese, right? So it by definition, there's a lot of power in that dynamic, but there's also power dynamics in even the selection, for example, of who participates in these programs. Most of the times it would either be sort of Chinese embassies in different African countries that sort of pre-vet or pre-select. So there are obviously a lot of angles to looking at who is benefiting or who is targeted by these professionalization trainings. The one thing that's interesting about that, to balance that, is just the idea that these are recurrent trainings. So the sort of the pool of participants keeps extending in that regard. Whether to the point of whether there are African, or there's a sort of an exchange, or there's an influence or a flow of norms coming from Africans towards China. I mean, I think it really, you can look at it from a perspective of maybe even like work that has been done recently about CSR, a lot of pushback. Obviously, there's a lot of variance as to where is the pushback coming from, what countries specifically, but there is a lot of work that's kind of done to look at how strong civil society and NGO groups in different African countries have responded or have tried to react to certain norms, for example, when it comes to labor, when it comes to other things, and environment. So there is an exchange in that perspective, but it's not structured in the same way that that these professionalization trainings are. So there's no equivalent, right? There's no professionalization training programs for Chinese civil servants and officials. There's a clear hierarchy in that. It's very vertical in that sense, right? So you know, it's not you know, equal on that level. And this connects to the question of whether China is similar to everybody else or doing things differently, and the point about putting this in the context of history. And I agree with you. I mean, it's not trainings is not something that was created by China. Obviously, you brought up the example of the early 20th century, but also you know, in the 60s, for example, the Soviet Union, for example, was providing a lot of trainings for African officials as well, like the whole Lumumba University, and of course, like also India provides a lot of trainings. Germany provides a lot of trainings. It's not just it's not something that just China is doing, but the difference I would say there is perhaps the scope and the scale of these trainings are a little bit different. And To the question of who are these people or what's the content exactly, what's going on. So, I mean, aside from what I mentioned, which was more or less an academic example, if you look at some of the workshops that I participated in just as an observer, there were presentations, it's a workshop, there were presentations about irrigation systems, about agricultural practices, about, and you know, there was a lot of demonstration in that sense, but not in the context. So it remains a good point to understand the disconnect between the context and the actual trainings. And I think to your point, perhaps the reason why not all of these trainings are done in the context is to include this aspect of demonstrating the success of the development, to see it on the ground rather than speak about it from far away, or rather than talk about these irrigation systems or these technical skills in Morogoro or in, so just think and bring sort of the high-level officials to China to see that for themselves. A lot of times also these workshops have a commercial element to them, in which there are lots of equipments that are being presented, and also consultancy services, and so it's really a whole bunch of things that are going on at the same time. So not just you know, one just dimension. And what I wanted to say about your point about the context there is that these workshops are very dynamic. So there's a lot of feedback. They change. So perhaps my experience with what I've looked at in 2015 or 16 could or could not be different. So I just wanted to acknowledge the limitation of that itself. That it might be useful to do a more systematic sort of over time, kind of like a longitudinal study to see, you know, how they change or what changes in them. But in my experience, like I said, delegates who were in Beijing and I talked to them, they did not shy away from saying, well, this doesn't apply to me, right? This is not useful to me. But in a sense, that feedback itself, well, what's done out of it? What's made out of it? Is there the next iteration of this, does it take it into account or no? I don't, you know, so it would be interesting to see the dynamics of that, whether that, you know, changes over time or not. So, yeah.
Thank you. And the last word to you, Paul.
Sure, I'll try to make it quick. So the question about change. There was the former government in Madagascar was probably one of the more democratically elected governments, and the Minister of Health was very effective in that government, but they had a lot more power until they were covertly overthrown by France. And the current government, the Ministry of Health, has almost absolutely no power. So that's the big difference. What China is doing over time is not markedly different, as Professor Brodigan pointed out, going back to the 1960s. But I think the reception and the need, not necessarily with China, but with other countries, to have to go through a stronger Ministry of Health was different in the former administration. And regarding this idea of sameness, this is a really interesting question for me, because I started out with this belief that by virtue of the different structure of China's health diplomacy that is contrary to normative Western health aid that is vertical and focuses on specific diseases, malaria, HIV, TB, Chinese health diplomacy has always been horizontal. It's been building infrastructure. It's been focused on primary health care. It really took that off, even though it was, championed by Alma-Ata and kind of closed down in China at the same point. They did focus on primary health care and their health diplomacy. So I thought that would make a huge difference in outcome. I thought also that the theories behind it, that the five elements and the 8 elements, I thought they would make a huge difference. But I was surprised to find out that, no, the outcome was very, very similar, if not the same, by virtue, or if not worse, actually, by virtue of not working with the Ministry of Health in this case.
Thank you. All I have left to do is to thank this panel for a great start.